Welcome to episode 2 of Cloud Masters, a no-fluff cloud podcast brought to you by DoiT International. Sam, you're a TAM, Technical Account Manager at DoiT. We're joined here by 2 other TAMs. Andrew, who I believe you're based in California. Ian, somewhere in the United Kingdom.
Yeah, that's right. Sunny Cambridge.
I'm in the Seattle area, Matan.
Oh, my bad. I just assume everyone in the West Coast is just in California because that's where I'm from.
Yeah, fair assumption.
It's just a California bias. I use the word TAM, Technical Account Manager. I see you guys as kind of this hybrid of business savvy with technical expertise and a sprinkle of FinOps. Is that fairly accurate, what you guys help customers with?
Sounds like a pretty good call, but since Ian's my manager, let's hand it over to him to give the spiel on what a TAM is.
Yeah, and I'll preface this by saying that we're going to go over Cloud Bill red flags.
So a technical account manager for me, and I've been doing the role at different businesses for a while now. So I always see my role as I call myself a consulting advisor and my team of advisors. And so whilst we're not there actually helping people transform code, what we're doing is ultimately trying to reduce the friction of using technology in the cloud. So there's if you look at the vendor's straight outputs, it looks like you just do 3 clicks and you've got an entire business running. And sure, if you're happy running on defaults, that's the case. The truth is to get to the point where you've got actual deliverable content that you really want, it's much, much harder than it appears. And so helping customers understand that it's okay, that it is difficult, and that there are ways of overcoming some of these challenges. That's what we do as technical account managers. So we focus on reducing the friction of using that new technology. And quite often that actually just boils down to, hey, why is my stuff costing so much? So in EMEA, all the TAMs are FinOps certified, so we can have those conversations in a fairly meaningful manner.
Not everyone gets a TAM. It's pretty it's a pretty exclusive group of customers that get technical account managers. I was just looking at the list from our internal Confluence, so I was actually surprised to see how small it is. So anyone who's listening that has a TAM, consider yourself lucky. Now, we're here to talk about Cloud Bill red flags, and what do I mean by that? These are basically just instances in your Cloud Bill that may be reflective, non-obvious instances that in your Cloud Bill that may be reflective of an anti-pattern. And so what I want to do today on today's episode is take the collective wisdom of you 3, you're all TAMs, from helping customers navigate their Cloud Bill, and I want to distill that into some of maybe the strangest or the hardest to pick out red flags, the ones that are especially non-obvious, and then we want to share that with the broader community. I want to kick this off with one that you brought up with me a while ago that kind of caught me off, that kind of surprised me, and I guess you've seen in the past CloudTrail being one of the top services in your bill. That actually happens.
Yeah, that's one of my favorites from a long time ago. Basically, everyone in cloud likes to talk about event-driven architectures and this kind of thing, and that's wonderful. And I really think it is a good way to work. Unfortunately, I had a particular customer that configured their environment so that every workload had its own CloudTrail deployed. And so for anyone that's experienced with AWS CloudTrail, it's an audit trail of all the events going on at an API level within your AWS account. It's got nothing to do with the internals of your, for example, EC2 instances or anything like that. It's really, when did someone turn this on or turn it off, or auto scale event happened or something like that. And they were subscribing to that to generate events to then power the next part of the automation, whatever is going on. The AWS pricing model is that your first cloud trail in an account in a region is for free. So it should generally be free, and everyone can subscribe to the events from that. But this particular customer was deploying events after events, trails after trails after trails, and therefore paying a lot of money for CloudTrail. So for me, the red flag here is anytime you are paying for CloudTrail at all, let alone when it's one of your top services, it should always be free for all customers. And one of the most common times that I used to see that not being free is when Amazon came out with a new feature. They came out with the organization's CloudTrail. You set it and forget it from your organization's management account, previously known as payer account. You set it and forget it there, and it deploys it across all accounts in your organization in all regions, and everything's wonderful. But it doesn't delete the existing ones. So now you've got at least 2 and you're paying for them. So it's a good one for people to go through, and it's usually an easy saving, a couple of $1,000 a month. You can knock it off your account.
Ian, you brought up something yesterday around storage costs. I think not just like a one-time thing, but seeing your storage costs steadily increase.
So of course your storage is always going to cost. Now it's relatively cheap these days to be storing data, and so it's easy to overlook. But it's a deeper thing than the actual just transit cost that you've got from the data. So it's here in Europe, it's GDPR and data privacy challenges. So you don't want to be retaining data for too long. So a common problem is that you may be taking snapshots from or backups, and of course, when they're set up, they're a great idea, and everybody checks that and does the sensible thing to make sure that they're actually good data and can be used, etc. What tends not to happen is that they don't check in later on to see whether the appropriate life cycles are applied. So what you get is a build-up of storage over time. So you end up with an excess of snapshots. You'll end up with potentially a log store growing. And so what you do is you can use whichever your favorite analytic tool of choice, do a report over your storage and have a look to see, is there a line that's just going up? And if there is, then that's your telltale. So you're looking, so do a quick check and say, okay, is the storage only going up? Because if it is, it might be that it just hasn't reached its life cycle timeout yet. So it might be that it's there for 6 years, for example, in some cases, in legal cases. But it's more usual that it's going to be a 30-day or a 90-day life cycle. So if you're seeing that just going straight up, then check on it, make sure the appropriate life cycles are applied. I've saved customers thousands a month just by checking in on this. So you've got things like multi-part uploads, which can be taken care of on AWS with lifecycle policies as well. So by checking on those lifecycle policies, super low-hanging fruit, but super effective. And so you can tell whether you've got a problem just by having a quick look at the graphs and seeing if the graph is only going up. Then even if it's a small amount of data, then it could be that data shouldn't be around and is actually a violation of your data privacy settings for your company. So it's an easy thing to check, and it can get ahead of problems in the future.
Another thing that was brought up a while back from you, Sam, was getMetricData from CloudWatch. This is a SKU that basically tells you something with Datadog. Or is it any service, or is it strictly related to Datadog here?
Yeah, let's not blame one company here. Okay. It's definitely not just related to Datadog, but So this one is one of those ones. It can be considered a cost of business, it's really, I guess, a good time to mention that the same thing that we said yesterday in the last episode is that you cannot optimize things without knowing what they are, right? But getMetricData is one where companies that provide you with information about your AWS environments or any, I guess. And I'm looking at things like Cloud Health, New Relic, Datadog. All of these products work in similar ways, where they have a role. It's a limited role that they can read some of your metrics out of AWS, typically CloudWatch, to find out, for example, if you're using your instances properly, how many requests you had on your database, or useful information. It's really good. To try to get more real time, they scan your account really regularly, and that can be up to them every minute or maybe more. I'm not sure where they're at these days, but what ends up happening is that you pay for not only their software, but you also pay for the API requests they're making in your account. And yes, it's very important to know when your system's going down. It is a good cost of business, and I think it's reasonable. But there are some situations where, for example, in a dev account that's got lots of resources, you end up paying a huge amount for CloudWatch because of this API call coming from the monitoring software. There are a few solutions. We've got an upcoming episode where we're going to talk to one of my customers about how they got rid of that cost with a whole new architecture. But even if you don't want to change things greatly, a simple call through to those companies and asking them to turn down the volume on that account. So instead of sampling the data every minute, to maybe sample it every quarter of an hour on the dev accounts. And generally they can tweak the configuration for you. It's not something that's, it never used to be exposed through the APIs or through their consoles, but you can turn that data volume down and then, save a bit of money on the metadata about everything, I guess.
Simple not even a technical solution, just to ask them to fetch the data less frequently.
There's a technical solution on their end. They need to make some changes.
Need to change a number from 1 to 15.
Yeah, I like what Sam said about you can't really optimize unless you know what it is, because I think that's immediately a red flag, right? If you see something in the bill that you just don't know what it is, it's a new service, let's say, or some sort of spike or any sort of change, then that's definitely something to investigate, I would say.
Yeah. Who started using BigQuery all of a sudden? What do we?
Yeah.
Not to pump our own tires, but we did just release a Zapier integration, and one of the triggers is basically alerts you when someone in your company, when a new service is being used in your cloud environment. So that's probably helpful for anyone who's a customer that's listening.
Yeah, the trouble is, like, it's a cool idea. I think it'll be great for us, but it needs to do like maybe a 30-day check-in or something as well. Like, you've started using this. Did you realize that you're spending way too much on it? or what's your experience running it in production now? How's it going?
One of my favorite examples is where a new dev team were excited by new technology. So they adopted a bunch of new services, which of course is a great thing to do, and that's how we innovate and get new ideas. But they had the question, how much logging do we need to do? So they were like, well, we don't know, so we'll just log it all. And so they just turned everything up to kind of close to max. And then it made its way into production at that level. And they had a shocking amount of excess data. And my first question to them when I was looking at the bill was, hey, this is quite a lot of detailed data. How are you actioning that? It turns out they were projecting it onto a dashboard. They didn't have any automation off of it. So I was like, well, maybe many times a second for that particular workload isn't really necessary. Maybe we could turn that down a bit. They turned it down to once every 5 minutes and didn't even notice because the granularity of the dashboard didn't even show up. So they were just burning excess cache there essentially. And so they turned it down and saved a bag of money. So it's an easy thing to happen. And I've seen it happen for very mature teams as well, just because that's not your primary focus, right? You've got to work it. You've done all your testing. You've done your UAT. It's ready to go. Maybe just a last spot check to make sure that you've got the appropriate level of monitoring and logs.
Logging is a really interesting one though, because I've seen production times when it should be the most expensive. Should maybe is the wrong word to use here, but a really common serverless architecture. So I was working with a customer who had a serverless connected vehicle platform, and they were taking a lot of IoT style events, processing them through things like Lambda on AWS, and obviously doing work with the data. And every time those Lambdas fired, they would emit a short status message to say starting the function, and then at the end, stopping the function. You can't turn that off. That alone was accounting for something like 30% of their logging traffic. So even once they did all the right things and turned the velocity down on the logs and so on, it was still a huge amount of data. And the only way we actually found to stop that was to remove the IAM role on the Lambda function so it couldn't write. And AWS doesn't charge you for it if it doesn't, even if you attempt to write it, but it doesn't hit the CloudWatch, you don't get charged for it. So little tip, if you really want to save money on logging, you can take away permissions for it.
I've definitely seen the same thing before, Sam, specifically in relation to Lambda, where that logging just completely spikes up. Yeah, logging is definitely an interesting one. I completely agree with everything that's been said. I think I had a customer ask me kind of what ratio is kind of a good ratio of how much you should spend on logging compared to their overall infra. And I don't know if there's like a specific ratio because it kind of depends on what your needs are. But if you're spending more than 20% or more on logging, that's probably a sign that you probably want to take a look at what you actually are logging, whether you need it. If you're at like the 5%, 10% level, that sounds like it's pretty good to me from most people from what I've seen. But I've seen examples where logging was more expensive or almost more expensive than their compute itself. And that's definitely probably not optimal. So
that's a really good shout. That's a pretty common question. I mean, I like 10% logging is probably okay. I had a customer that was doing just over 26% logging, and I called it out. I was like, this is quite heavy. And it was a banking customer, financial industry. So they had lots of reasons. Ultimately, the reasons were just poor discipline. Ultimately, from an initial, so they just logged everything just in case because they were afraid of the financial auditing and inspection. So, and I ended up having discussions with the security team, because of course everybody was like, oh, we need it for security. So I spoke to the security team and they're like, no, we don't need this level. And then it was like, I was passed around the various teams, each thinking the other people needed it. We ended up saving them, we saved them $30K a month. Unfortunately, for the amount they were spending, it was a rounding error practically. So they were still overspending on the logging by a fair old chunk. But it's knowing what good looks like and having an idea of it is, again, I think it's a blind spot, right? It's because if you don't know, you don't know. So maybe a quarter of your bill on logging is entirely valid. But in that case, it definitely was not.
It does sound excessive, but I wonder, can we break that down further? I mean, should we have more or less logging in a dev or test environment than we do in a production environment?
See, that's exactly how we save that $30K a month, right? So they put in some dev switches which turned off the excess logging in the lower level environments. And so, because they realized that you don't need it's in dev, you need some logging. You just don't need you don't need the same sort of logging you need in production. It's different kind of metrics, different kind of signals. So yeah, and it's the same for all monitoring. Honestly, if it's in lower level environments, you should be using more Spot. You should be using less monitoring, and you should be looking for the signals that are on the thing you've just tested should be really high debug level. But for the rest of it should just be turned right down, because if it breaks, you just turn it off and on again. It's not going to have high impact in production. That's money making. And so a good rule of thumb I used to use was that if production plus pre-prod is costing more than everything else, wonder why. Because sure, you're doing development and R&D and innovation, sure. But if I had some cases where it was like 7 to 10 times more expensive for the non-production workloads. Like I pointed out to the customer, those workloads are not directly making you any money. So consider, is this really necessary? Do you need to have 3 replicas of an RDS database across multiple zones for a developer? Or can you turn that down when you're deploying it in the Terraform and maybe just save a little cash there? Because if you do that and you're at enough scale, then you can save a lot of money really quickly with no impact is the point. So I think these things are easily overlooked. And because ultimately, as a customer, you're just trying to shift features out to get them in front of paying customers as quickly as possible. So some of these smaller points are easily overlooked. So I don't think I advise people not to beat themselves up because they've missed it. It's a pretty common mistake. And just knowing where to look is the key aspect, I feel.
And I think also asking the right questions. Like you mentioned 2 situations, one of which teams weren't communicating with one another. And another situation where a team wasn't asking, do we need to be receiving metrics here every second?
Yeah, exactly. And so but then communication is clearly difficult because I've never gone to a customer and found that they've solved this as a problem. So again, we just have to accept that this is the real world. There's going to be bad communication. It's okay to be making these errors. It's just that having systems in place and mechanisms to be able to identify and spot them so we can then make sure that they don't get repeated and end up becoming very costly. It's okay to make mistakes, just let's not make them too expensive. That's the phrasing I use.
But I mean, I think, what you've said there about it's sometimes hard to spot this stuff or hard to know what the question is. I think that's where the benefit of having an external party helps a little bit, right? Now, it doesn't necessarily need to be you or I. But as a TAM, we've obviously got a lot of experience working with a lot of customers. And we see some of these things as almost anomalous type things. And if a customer has a very high percentage of CloudTrail or CloudWatch or a number of other services that I regularly see, if that's a bigger percentage on their bill, then we're going to worry about it. What are your thoughts on how someone who maybe doesn't have access to a TAM or doesn't have access to a partner to help them with this, how can they find out what are the right questions to ask?
The advice I've always given others is to be curious, right? So, because the first problem is if the glass is already full, you can't add anything to it. So accept that you don't necessarily know the right answers, and so be curious, go and look for it. But yeah, that was I don't have a direct answer other than maybe get a partner to help you.
Yeah, I think on a high level, the few places I kind of think of red flags in billing in 2 categories. One being kind of those gradual increases, a gradual kind of unexpected, growth where things might get a little bit out of control. And, if you're seeing any of these trends where something is increasing much more than you're expecting, that's probably one indicator to see on a high level. Maybe you should be considering looking at this a little bit more. And also, not necessarily just gradual, also just is your bill reflective of what the advantages of the cloud brings you? As an example, if you have a lot of EC2 or compute engine instances and it's just totally flat, 24/7, the graph every day is exactly the same amount. You have your instances on all the time. That it might be worth considering why that is, because the advantage of the cloud is that it is, very flexible. You can, scale up and scale down very quickly. And so even though that doesn't seem like actually an issue on the like just when you immediately look at the bill, like there's definitely room to optimize if you're noticing that's just completely flat. And the other category of like red flags that I see are those sudden, unexpected increases where, you haven't used a service before and suddenly you see it grow very quickly. You see a very sudden spike, or the common ones I see are related to things that are infinitely scalable and serverless typically. If there's no guardrails with those, then I've had a couple of examples where customers have had sudden spikes in BigQuery, for example, because one example that comes to mind, because it was the most impactful one, was an engineer built something new and it had an endless loop. So BigQuery and PubSub and Cloud Functions were speaking to each other. I don't remember, this was a while ago, so I don't remember exactly what the architecture was, but it was continuously speaking to each other and going in an endless loop. And that ended up costing them, I think, around $300,000 in the course of like a couple of hours, I think less than a whole day. So this was from one engineer who drove up that cost, and it's because they didn't have any appropriate guardrails at the time. They didn't have quotas. They were using something that they didn't quite expect that to happen. So things like that, right? I think those are kind of the other red flags. So whenever you're using something that's infinitely scalable, it's probably good to really read up on the pricing, make sure you understand exactly what it's pricing you on, and finding ways to mitigate that. Or in the case of like BigQuery, they have other pricing models as well. So maybe the on-demand pricing model isn't the best one for you. But yeah, those are generally the two categories that I see in terms of things that are alarming to me in terms of cloud billing.
Guessing that 300K wasn't a rounding error.
No, it might have been more. I don't remember exact amount. So we had an okay solution as a result, but
I don't want to turn this into like a, mine's bigger than yours kind of competition, but I did have a customer at AWS who did that with a small Lambda function that took a backup file and encrypted it when it was placed into an S3 bucket. Unfortunately, it placed the file back next to the original version, and the trigger wasn't very specific. So the Lambda kept encrypting the file, dumping it there, and recalling itself. 28 days, $700,000. It was.
Can you beat that, Ian?
I don't think so. No, I'm just thinking that the thing is, we've all got engineering in our past, right? So I think we've all got tales of the time that you press the enter key and then realize that you logged into the wrong server and you just executed the function on the wrong thing, and so I'm just thinking of those engineers that were responsible for pressing those buttons and activating those services. I'm like, you think you're having a rough day until you learn that these things happen, and so people have really bad days. But so I will say that actually one of a red flag that is less technology focused, and it reminds me. So I was at one of the post summit events. I was speaking to one of my customers, the principal engineer at the organization, been there for a very long time, and he was telling me how he gets technology right quite a lot. So essentially he's the CCOE. He is the center of excellence that talks about new technologies. We were having a little chat and a back and forth, and I realized I actually ended up making him question his entire reality, which wasn't my intention, but it ended up heading that direction because I asked him, how does he know he's right? And of course, he was like super confident that it was absolutely the right thing to do to choose a particular technology or process. And so I asked him a few questions back and forth, and he ended up sort of doing that, staring into the middle distance, kind of bemusing and stroking his chin a bit, because I think he realized that you can't be objectively right. There is no objectively right. And so he's making technology decisions for his company. How is he checking that they're the right decisions? They might turn out to be good or bad in the long run, but right is probably the wrong term. And so when you've got engineers that have got some experience, certainly in a particular field, making sure that people are checking with other people. So asking other teams and asking for advice, making sure that your knowledge is kind of grounded. That's super important. Otherwise, you end up in an echo chamber where you're making technology decisions. Famously, we've always done it this way. That's a big red flag in itself, right? And so catching those design decisions and those design choices for service adoption, etc., that for me is a common problem that I see. So because everybody feels that they know how this stuff works, they end up not adopting things using the newer technology, maybe more upstack, more as a service kind of functions. And then they box themselves into a corner that ultimately, in many cases, the customer is never freed from that kind of that vice grip until that engineer leaves and they realize, hey, there's actually loads of what we've been burning extra cycles all of this time. We've been spending time keeping the lights on when we could have been actually focusing on features. So mere red flag is to make sure that doesn't matter what your experience is or what your knowledge is, try to check yourself and say, hey, you know what, is this actually a good idea? And the only way of really doing that is to ask other people and take advice.
I do that every time I go out and I send a picture to my mom and she lets me know. But yeah.
Is that in itself, is that an echo chamber? If it's just your mom who, by law has to love you.
100% of the time I look beautiful. So
So I think, coming back to if it's the right person to ask, and I think asking yourself is probably not. But I have to give a shout out here to the AWS solution architects and the Google Cloud customer engineers. Generally a bunch of people that have a huge amount of experience with different customer environments and can give you some really good advice on at least different ways of thinking about things. They might not necessarily agree with the technology choice and you might not agree with theirs. That's okay. But at least, if you come back to Andrew's example before of running the same number of instances 24/7 for the whole month, you probably need someone to have a look at that. And there's a lot less obvious versions of that discussion with architecture that, getting extra pair of eyes in, especially when that doesn't cost anything from your cloud provider, is maybe a good idea.
Are you talking about us?
That can also help, yes. But I was specifically calling out AWS SAs and GCP CEs. But
Yeah, I will say just a short plug in terms of the BigQuery issue I mentioned. It was only 300,000 because of the fact that it was found through anomaly detection. It could have been a lot higher than that. They stopped it immediately when they saw it. So just a little plug, having do its anomaly detection definitely really helped there.
We only allow small plugs on this podcast. This is not promotional. Do it. Although if you want to work with us, you can go to our website, contact us. Now, you talked about a case where, infinitely scalable serverless services with no guardrails. That's essentially like a red flag. On the topic of guardrails, Sam, we talked about how even some folks aren't doing some simple things with organizational policies as far as like limiting regions and limiting instance types and stuff like that. Could you speak more on that?
Absolutely. A couple of times I've been working with customers who had the unfortunate situation of being hacked. I don't like using the word hacked because basically they put their keys somewhere on a GitHub repo or something like that. And someone found it before they could change them. So what generally happens in that situation, in my experience, is the attackers will look into your account and find out where you're not running stuff, and then they'll go and run it there because you're not looking there. You've got a blind spot. It doesn't necessarily have to be malicious. It can be someone making a mistake or something as well, or just forgetting about things. But as a best practice in a security as well as cost optimization step, I always recommend to enable policies that prevent people from doing that. Now, there's a few similar ones. Regions is a classic. I personally run all my infrastructure in Europe. I don't have any reason to run anything in Australia, even though I'm from there. No reason to run anything in South America. So I've blocked on all my accounts the ability to do that. There are a few places like US East 1. You don't want to block that if you're using AWS because there's still things always going on there. But that's just one example. The other thing that I think is a really cool idea is limiting the possibility of people making mistakes in a dev account. And it's genuinely mistake type stuff like accidentally choosing an X1 instead of a T4 instance. An X1E costs you sort of millions of dollars a year. It's got terabytes upon terabytes of gigaflops and everything else. It's an absolutely massive beast. most people don't need that in a dev environment. And if you do, you can make an exception. But, I would go ahead and pretty much prevent anybody from spinning up, whether it's a very large Redshift instance, whether it's a 24 extra large EC2 instance, or on the Google side, a high mem 196 into or something like that. It's fairly unlikely people need that in tests. So putting in some intelligent guardrails, and I sort of like to call them, make sure that a developer doesn't pop a typo into a Terraform template or something that spins up hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of cost.
Unless others have more, I have one more that I wanted to bring up that was brought up with the group, but we can go on and on. Sam, you mentioned a customer was storing 2 gigabytes of data and paying around $3,000 a month for it.
Yeah, this is a recent one, actually. So I had this customer that they said to me, why is our cost of, it was Google Cloud Storage, so same as an S3 bucket, so AWS, Google, same here. Why is our cost going up on this bucket every month? And as we started looking into it, we realized the amount of data being stored hadn't changed at all in 2 months, and it was like 2 gigabytes. It was almost nothing. And as we started diving into it, took a little while, going through a few different dashboards, we found out that it was actually the read requests on the bucket. So as we started getting closer to an answer, one of the engineers at their side went, oh my God, he sort of had one of those realization moments that never make you feel particularly good. It's a bit like Ian mentioned about pressing enter on the wrong server. He had that realization moment. He said, it's the Vault. I said, what? They were running HashiCorp Vault on one of their cloud buckets, and each month they were adding the number of Kubernetes clusters that were querying that Vault. And the cost was going up because the number of containers that were needing to query the Vault was increasing month on month. So they were actually spending something like $2,000 a month, $3,000 a month by the time we caught it on these requests. And every single container within the clusters was calling every time it needed a password for something. It was calling for a fresh copy of the password. Now that's not necessarily needed, and there are plenty of ways to mitigate that. The simplest one is in the client itself. You can say, don't request the new one so often, or cache it for 15 minutes or half an hour or something, with a couple of rollouts and a couple of, so there's a slight change in their container configurations, but they brought that back down to a very reasonable number, I think down to $100 a month now or something like that. So something much more reasonable. Yeah. I mean, it's a similar situation to what Ian said. It's a bit of a rounding error for that company, but it was a curiosity for them, much like I think was mentioned earlier on the call, where people just see this sort of slowly increasing, like the temperature with the frog, right? If you put them in a cold kettle. So I think they eventually got to a point where they said, this is really a lot. We're not storing anything here. What's going on? So it was a nice win to have, yeah.
So that's a good point. And so a lot of people don't really, I guess, they understand a frontal lobe kind of level, but they don't understand the impact of it. So it's like things like a common mistake I saw at AWS was they've got some S3 storage stuff, which is a fantastic place to put it. It's very durable and very accessible. And there was they were doing functions which essentially were listing the contents of the S3 bucket for what that was the nature of their workload. And so they were like, hey, we're listing this data. We're just it's a part of the workload. They didn't realize that there's a cost for each of those for accessing S3, and so their actual access, just doing that rather useless list function, was costing them, as it goes, that was only a few $100s a day, but that was in that one workload. And then we explored a little further, and we realized that this was systematic right across the whole business. So there was cumulatively thousands of dollars a day just being burned for these excess calls to S3. So their actual storage itself was there, and there was a nice flat line, so there was no red flag there. But the red flag was around these extra API calls all the time. So it was like they really build up. And in that instance, they just cached it, and so they slashed those costs. They were like 100 times cheaper just because they just cached the directory and they only just refreshed it whenever they actually felt like it was updated. So they just put some extra intelligence into their application, saved themselves a bag of cash. But those API calls can get really expensive, and that's across multiple services as well. It's not just, I've used S3 as the example here, but it's like, DynamoDB, etc. as well. All of these, there's a cost for those API calls, and that cost really adds up quickly. So it becomes a bit of a tax. It's like I always tell people in the cloud that networking costs can be a bit stealthy and can end up being a bit of a tax, but the just calling stuff and just using the services themselves, think about how much that you're doing, and is there something you can do in the client to kind of buffer that?
You called out networking costs, one of my bugbears. Is it a cost of doing business to have your instances in multiple availability zones and therefore have to pay for data transfer?
It's one of those. I remember when I was doing my initial training, because I worked at AWS and I was going there. There's the fire hose training initially, and so I thought I knew how to design systems beautifully. I didn't really consider the cost because, hey, why would I? I was just designing them beautifully. So the question was, how would you design a system? And my first contact with a customer, I was like, hey, let's stick it across multiple regions, across 100 different zones. It's like, really make it really super. Yeah, this is going to be super great. Very quickly realized that the cost is actually quite often the strongest factor. So, and I know that there are some very, very large customers indeed that are using the cloud, and they've got critical workloads all running inside one availability zone. And so, everybody does like screen face emojis and oh my God, but actually it's okay for them because that particular workload can suffer some downtime. And so if it's seeing some downtime for that workload, that's going to take, say, 10, 20 minutes to spin up in a new AZ because it's a pilot light, that's absolutely fine for them. So that's a risk versus reward kind of moment. So you don't always have to run 3-tier systems across 3 AZs and then patch them across to multiple regions. Sure, it makes every solutions architect smile and dream of fairies, and it's just like, hey, this is a fantastic design. Ultimately, you don't need to go crazy with that stuff in the real world. You need to design for your use case and then work backwards from that.
You won't be passing an SA Pro exam with that answer.
Yeah, I think FinOps as a process exists for a reason, right? I think cloud billing in general is quite complex. I've worked with pricing and billing within the cloud for quite a while now, and I don't have all the numbers memorized at all. So I think, while it might be difficult just if you don't look at billing very often to know how the impact of everything will affect your spend immediately just by looking at it, like catching those trends, catching those spikes, and then maybe looking at the pricing model for services that you use a lot of might be a good place to start. As an example, Ian mentioned, and I think maybe Samuel did as well, in terms of just S3 and cloud storage. There's so many different pricing models within just those 2 storage services alone, right? In terms of having lifecycle policies, you can get it to a cheaper tier. However, there's implications for that, right? If you retrieve it early, you'll have a cost. If you have a lot of operations done on those buckets, you'll have a cost. If you're pulling it from a different region, you have a different kind of cost, right? And so depending on how you have that all structured, you can use the same amount of storage and have completely different costs depending on what tier you're using, whether you have it in a single zone, multi-region, multi-zone. And it's kind of difficult to just know that all like automatically. So if it's a service that you're using a lot of, I would say it's probably a good idea to either, one, if you have a technical resource you can reach out to, whether it's through a partner or through an AWS rep or a GCP rep or their CEs, maybe ask them, but secondarily, maybe look at the pricing page and get a good idea of kind of exactly how you're spending. And I guess one kind of specific one that might be helpful to know, if you use GCP multi-region storage, they made a few changes to the pricing model there. And in particular, for multi-region buckets, if you have a lot of like activity that goes on in those buckets, there is a replication charge now for multi-region. There's also an inter-region egress charge. So that charge for multi-region buckets hits you if you have another service speaking to that bucket within GCP at any time. Now, if you have that as a dual region bucket or a single region, and it's speaking to that bucket within the same region or one of the dual regions, you avoid that egress charge as an example. But for multi-region, you'll hit it no matter what. So those are like little things that you might not think of, but the impact for that can be quite large. I've had a couple customers where those 2 charges alone, their multi-region egress and replication was more than the storage cost. And so when you see that, it's a good signal to ask your technical resources as well as look at the pricing page to understand exactly what's going on there.
Well, we have a lot of red flags that we went over. I think a lot more than I anticipated, to be honest, which is great. We have room for one more. If someone has one last one, they get the comment. If not, we can sign off. I think we've dropped a lot of, well, you guys, not me. I'm just the jester, but we dropped a lot of wisdom today. Any last red flag someone wants to bring up?
No, I don't have a specific red flag, but what I would say is, I guess, to echo what Andrew said there, right? Reading the pricing pages can be really helpful. I remember back, still have PTSD from when Amazon first enabled automatic lifecycle for objects on S3, and customers that were spending $100,000 a month suddenly got $1 million bill because they didn't understand the pricing method and understand that objects would be, I think, a minimum size 128K, and it was just one of those situations where not understanding what a product does can cost you an awful lot of money. So the red flag, I guess, is RTFM. If you haven't done that, then you're going to be in trouble.
I think we decided this is a swearing podcast, but we're just going to bleep with the dolphin noise. Yeah, I've made that the podcast policy. Well, that's about it. Thank each and every one of you for joining me or joining us today and dropping some knowledge. And for those listening, we hope you got at least one nugget of wisdom out of this. We discussed things that are some of them are AWS specific, or we use AWS as the example, but there's always the equivalent service on GCP or in Azure in this case. So we hope you got something out of it, and hope to have you as a listener in the next episode.